You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Hey everyone, wanted to give you a quick content warning as we get into the start of this episode. We are going to be talking about some difficult topics this week, and it's going to center around corporal punishment, spanking. There will be some sexuality and mentions of physical and spiritual abuse. So if these are sensitive topics for you, please listen with care. And as always, prioritize your own mental, emotional, and spiritual health and well-being first and foremost. One other thing I want to say before we actually get into the discussion itself. No matter which side of this issue you currently come down on, I want to ask you to approach this conversation with an open heart and an open mind. Because whenever we talk about spanking and punishment and child rearing in general, that's a very personal conversation. It's not just theoretical, and it's hard to keep emotionally balanced sometimes when we discuss that. It's very personal. It's tied to our own childhoods. It's tied to our parenting. It's tied to our theology. And whenever the Bible is brought into a conversation, Christians have very strong opinions one way or the other. And I get it. I came into this conversation initially very strongly minded on the issue of spanking because of how I was raised, independent fundamental Baptist. I was completely convinced of one particular view of the Bible, and I believe that any deeper study of Scripture would confirm that belief. But I will be completely honest with you here up front. The exact opposite happened. The Bible actually changed my mind. So this conversation is not going to be about me trying to convince you of my own personal views. Rather, I want to just kind of walk you through my own journey with this and invite you to reconsider wherever you may be on the issue, to just come in with an open heart and mind and be willing to listen to what is actually in the Bible and what is the healthiest way forward when we are talking about the issue of spanking. And full disclosure up front here, I am not a parent, and I know that will immediately turn some of you off to what I am going to say, but I still ask you to hear me out, because this conversation is primarily about what is biblical and what is healthy. While I may not be a parent, I am a Bible scholar, and I am a therapist. So I am properly trained and qualified to speak into those realms. You do not have to have been a drug addict to help someone find a better way forward through their addiction. Now, if you have been down that road yourself, can that give you more insights than someone who hasn't been? Absolutely. But that doesn't mean that insights from people who haven't gone down that road themselves are completely invalid. And on top of that, most of the people I have learned from in my studies of this topic are themselves parents. So if that really is a hang-up for you, know that this is not just me speaking out of my own understanding, but that I am drawing from many other sources, and some I will link to in the show notes, where there are parents who agree with what I am saying. I'd say more so than would disagree. And I know I said a minute ago that I only had one other note before we get in, but I do still have one other thing I want to say here. This is an important conversation to have, even if you are not currently parenting, whether you have parented in the past or have never been a parent to this point. If you can figure this out before you parent, if you choose to, then that is by far the best situation. And if you have already started to parent, that's okay too. The best day to make a change for the better is yesterday, and the second best day is today. And spoiler alert, this conversation is actually for everyone, because your views on spanking have less to do with parenting and more to do with theology than you might think at first. So I want to approach this conversation slowly, respectfully, and honestly. Nothing in this conversation comes from a place of condemnation. It comes from grief, conviction, and love for our sacred texts, for our children, and for families who are trying their best. So my ask today is simple as we go into this. Please just listen. Hold space for the possibility that the Bible may not say what we were told it always says. Before we open the Bible itself, I want to take a second and make sure we are all on the same page about what spanking actually is, because it means a lot of different things to different people. Some only use their hands. Others use an instrument like a wooden paddle or a soup spoon or something along those lines, maybe a switch from out back or a belt. It can be just about anything. Some believe this has to be done immediately when wrong has happened, and some even occasionally in public. Others will wait till they get home. Some have been told that they need to calm down first to make sure that they don't do it in anger, often sending the kids to their room first. Some only do it as a last resort. Some do it immediately for direct disobedience. Some do it for anything that even just annoys the parent. Some do it as early as when the child is just a few months old. Some do it when the child is into adulthood, like late teenage stage. But the details aside, in general, spanking is a physical act of punishment in which an adult strikes offspring. And in the modern West, it is usually done on the child's bottom. Now, children have been hit as long as adults have. We are a violent species. But corporal punishment throughout human history did not at all look like what spanking looks like today. In fact, I will say right up front here that our modern idea of spanking being hitting a child on their bottom is not at all a biblical practice. That is not what was in the minds of anyone in the ancient world. Because throughout most of human history, corporal punishment was almost always on the face, like slapping someone's face, or on the back, literally striking them with some instrument, leaving a mark on their back. It was not at all on the bottom. This was literally slapping or beating children. Things that even the most sadistic of parents today would hopefully admit is wrong. I want to say this again. Corporal punishment throughout human history has not been on the buttocks. It has been on the back or the face. So what is the earliest evidence for what we call spanking today? Well, that is also not original to the Bible. The earliest evidence we have for people being struck on the bottom is ancient Greece. And it wasn't children. It was adult women who wanted to increase fertility. Believe it or not, we have record of priests administering spankings to adult women as a pagan sex ritual. And then later, in medieval and early Catholic Church history, spanking became part of adult penitential practice, even going so far as having some priests spanking adult women after confession to remove their sins. And then if we fast forward into Victorian Europe, spanking became more associated with sexual discipline, punishment, eroticism, and maintaining social appearances in hyper-strict homes. So if you think that kinky people have turned an act of child discipline into a weird sex thing in modern times, it's actually the other way around. Corporal punishment throughout most of human history was not striking someone on the bottom. That practice of spanking, as we would call it today, began in ancient pagan roots of fertility rituals. So spanking being a sexual thing is not some modern fetishization. Rather, that is the way it has always been, and people in the modern West took that and actually turned it into child discipline. They took something inherently sexual and made it about children. And if you don't believe me, feel free to double check anything that I am saying here today. I will just warn you that if you go ahead and do a Google search on issues of spanking, be prepared for some results that may not entirely be safe for work. All right, keep that in mind. Now, as we are going to see in the next several minutes, the phrases that we have associated with disciplining children as spanking don't really mean what we think they mean. In fact, I would say that probably the most famous phrase for spanking is spare the rod, spoil the child, right? And a lot of people believe that to be a biblical teaching. However, that sentence is nowhere in the Bible. The Bible never reads spare the rod, spoil the child. As far as we can tell, the phrase seems to be rooted in an extremely lengthy poem from 1377. It was called The Vision of William Concerning Piers Plowman, and was written by William Langold. He wrote, "Whoso spareth ye spring, spareth his children." Or, more modern English, whoever spares the rod spoils the child. But even that was right after a line about using a switch to beat an adult woman that he thought was being too lazy. So it's obviously not quite the same thing that we think of today with the modern idea of spanking. And the saying, as we are most familiar with it, first appears in a satirical poem from the early 1600s, Samuel Butler's Hudibras, which was about mocking religious hypocrisy and sectarianism. I want to read you a chunk from that poem. It is tremendously long, so I'm only going to do about a stanza here. But the context is really fascinating, and I guarantee you have never heard this before. He writes, "If matrimony and hanging go by destiny, why not whipping too? What medicine else can cure the fits of lovers when they lose their wits? Love is a boy by poets stilled, then spare the rod and spoil the child. A Persian emperor whipped his Granum, the sea his mother Venus came on, and hence some reverend men approve of rosemary in making love. As skilful coopers hooped their tubs with Lydian and Phrygian dubs, why may not whipping have as good a grace, performed in time and mood, with comely movement and by art, raise passion in a lady's heart? It is an easier way to make love by than that which many take. Who would not rather suffer whipping than swallow toasts of bits of ribbon?" Obviously, English has changed a lot in 400 years, so that was not the easiest thing to understand. But what he's saying here has nothing to do with actually disciplining children. If you pay attention to the context, he says, "Love is a boy by poets stilled, then spare the rod and spoil the child." So the boy here, the child here, is not a literal human child, but a personification of love itself. And as we get to the end of this section, he writes that a woman would rather be spanked to arouse her than to receive an expensive gift. I told you this wasn't going to be a safe for work episode. So we have, even just 400 years ago, evidence that spanking was not child discipline in the sense that we think of it today, but was still very erotic. That is not some modern thing that twisted ancient biblical truth. Rather, it has always been erotic, and we have taken child discipline, which was something separate, and merged it with this sexual kink. So when Christians today say spanking is biblical, the uncomfortable reality is that the quote unquote biblical practice is actually beating someone. What they're doing to their children when they spank actually comes from pagan rituals, erotic discipline, Victorian sexual repression, and later American fundamentalism, not scripture. And that leads to an equally disturbing truth. The idea that spanking must be done in love, not anger, something that many Christians were taught. Make sure you don't punish your children in anger. It has to be done in love. Yeah, well, guess what? That also doesn't come from the Bible either. It comes from a marketing copy of a book called the Spencer Spanking Plan, written for consenting husbands and wives to learn how to spank each other for marital harmony. And that language migrated into evangelical parenting books when the authors couldn't be bothered to take the time to double check where the saying came from. The teaching that you are to spank in love, not anger, is about sexual kinks from the Spencer Spanking Plan. Again, you can look it up, just be prepared for the results. All right? It has nothing to do with child discipline. We have inherited a cultural practice and then gone searching for Bible verses to twist out of context to justify it. How did we get there? Well, that's what we need to talk about next. James Dobson may be the most influential figure in mainstream spanking culture in Christian homes. In the 1970s to 90s, he framed spanking as the biblical method for breaking a child's will. If you either grew up in the 70s to early 2000s or you parented in the 70s to early 2000s, in Christian circles, like mainstream evangelical or fundamentalist circles, you were influenced by James Dobson, whether you realized it or not. He had a media empire that reached its tentacles out into all kinds of circles that he would never have approved of as a fundamentalist. And because much of Christian culture encourages blind following of spiritual leaders rather than actually searching out scripture, people just took what he said and assumed it was true because he threw a few Bible verses as quote-unquote proof. But he was not the expert testimony that he claimed to be. Yet, over time, people built on his work, and it's kind of funny how they would teach the same general thing, yet claim slightly different variations on what proper biblical spanking, quote unquote, would look like. Some taught it had to be done by hand, so the child would learn that love and punishment both come from the same person, and that you shouldn't be using a tool to hit your children, like a paddle or a spoon or a switch or a belt or anything like that. While others actually taught that using objects like that was really the only way to do it, so children would not associate your own hand with pain, as if children were too dumb to understand that you were the one holding the instrument. Or even some strange, bordering on perverse teachers who instructed parents to name the instrument, to give it some weird title that the children would become afraid of. And then two other really big names in these circles that became extremely influential are the Pearls. They were very, very fringe husband and wife couple, Michael and Debbie Pearl, but they have a surprising grasp on many fundamentalist circles of Christianity. They are very, very violent people. And if you even know the name Michael and Debbie Pearl, you probably come from a side of fundamentalism that borders on culty. They are not great people. A more common mainstream name that gets associated with spanking, though, is Ted Tripp. He has kind of tried to modernize it and make it sound not so bad, softening the ideas of people like Michael and Debbie Pearl and bringing the teachings of Dobson into a more modern age. But people like this still teach the same general basic stuff. Multiple spankings per offense, spanking for delayed obedience, not just disobedience, but delayed obedience, making sure you spank without anger, which, again, we said goes back to sexual kinks, not child discipline. Spanking as a means to remove guilt and sin, spanking to ensure sexual purity. Kind of ironic, isn't it? Well, regardless of the methods, each self-proclaimed parenting guru assured their trusting audience that their way was the one right way, and that any other forms of discipline were sin against God and a sure way to have rebellious and atheistic kids. But these teachings were often counterproductive. They commonly produced a fear of CPS in America or of government in more developed first world countries that have outlawed spanking. It created silence in the face of violence against others because it trained these children to expect violent actions from authority figures and not be able to speak out against it. It groomed them for abuse. It has also created authoritarian control without the ability to question for fear of even more strict and swift punishment, and ultimately a belief that any alternative parenting method is a sin against God Himself. This is not biblical discipline. It is American fundamentalist parenting culture shaped by fear and control and baptized in Bible language. And I know many of you listening right now are going, but Colin, there are so many verses in Scripture that talk about spanking and say you need to spank your children. Yeah, that's what I thought too. Let's talk about that now. Let's get this out in the open right at the start. There is not a single verse in the entire Bible that commands parents to spank children. Not one. I promise you, you can look from the first verse of Genesis to the last verse of Revelation, and you will not find an imperative sentence, a command to spank. Almost every argument that Christians use to defend spanking comes from one of just 5 verses in the book of Proverbs. Nothing else in the Bible. Proverbs is the go-to section for this. And again, there are only 5 verses that commonly get used. I realize if it's in the Bible, it's important, but there are over 31,000 verses in our Protestant Bibles. This is only dealing with 5 of them. So it is obviously not the most important of topics in God's mind. Furthermore, these being in Proverbs should tell us something, because Proverbs is a poetic wisdom book written by a father to a son, likely in adolescence. It was not written for parents about toddlers. There is a reason we call this book Proverbs, not promises, and definitely not how-to guide. Proverbs are general wisdom statements that apply in general ways, like early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Is that always the case? Can you get up early and go to bed early and still have health problems, still not be rich, still not be a wise person? Yeah, absolutely. But If you have that kind of structure in your life, will it lead to potentially better health, better job opportunities, better wisdom? Yeah, possibly, especially with the first two, but it's not a guarantee. See, genre is very important. I realize that what I just mentioned there was not in the Bible, but the same principle applies. If you need proof that Proverbs are not promises, just keep reading your Bible a little bit further past that book, because you're going to get to Ecclesiastes, which is all about the ways that Proverbs doesn't work. And we have a great series on that we did last year that you can check out, going through the book of Ecclesiastes. Or go back a couple books and check out Job, which is also about how Proverbs don't always work out. Now, none of that means that Proverbs is not an authoritative, inspired book of the Bible. It just means that we have to consider genre when we are doing interpretation. Proverbs is in the poetry section, is in the wisdom section, and poetry uses a lot of flowery language, a lot of analogies, a lot of metaphors. And one of them is the word rod. It's the Hebrew word shevet, and it is a rod or a staff. It is the same word used for a king's scepter or a shepherd's staff. In fact, the very first time that word gets used in the Bible is in Genesis as a reference to a symbol of authority, not of punishment, but of ruling authority. That should be a guide for how we see it show up in other passages. Or consider Psalm 23 with me. The famous verse, your rod and your staff, they what? Correct me? No. They beat me. No. It says they comfort me. These were symbols of the shepherd's guidance and care, not his punishment. If you were taught that shepherds beat their sheep or maybe even break a sheep's leg with the rod when they get out of line, you were handed a bald-faced lie in the hopes that you would never fact-check or question. Good shepherds, you know, the thing that Jesus claimed to be as an example for us, they don't ever use their rods violently against their sheep. Violent American men who got voted in as pastors took a made-up story and ran with it. What the rod is used for is literally right in front of us in Psalm 23. Comfort, not bruises. Guidance, not blows. And note once again that the rod is not a switch or a paddle or a hand or a belt, and it's not used on the buttocks. It is a staff that was occasionally used in the ancient Near Eastern culture of the Bible to strike criminals on their backs. This is why I said earlier that spanking is not at all in the Bible, and is actually following the ways of the world instead of the ways of God. Many of us were taught that anything other than spanking your child's rear end is unbiblical. But you're already reinterpreting scripture if you're using anything other than a shepherd's or king's staff on anything other than a person's back. Let me say that again. You are already reinterpreting scripture from modern times if you see a passage about using a rod and you use anything other than a shepherd's or king's staff on anywhere other than a person's back. So before you go ahead and try to accuse me of reinterpreting these verses for a modern time, just realize that when preachers tell you to spank, they are already doing that. Because no one's using a shepherd's staff or a king's scepter, and most are thankfully not doing it on a child's back. Now, false teachers like Dobson would say that God made your child's butt cushioned so they can be beaten there without leaving a mark that can get you in trouble with CPS. If you don't believe me, look it up. That has absolutely been said many times. I even remember hearing it growing up. But that's not what the biblical beating was. Biblical beating, if you really want to be biblical, left marks on a person's back, not the butt. The butt's close proximity to the genitals means that increased blood flow there, which is what happens when it is hit, leads to arousal in the genitals as well, revealing this modern practice of spanking for the sexual act that it has always been. Now, that being said, let's walk through these few proof texts that come out of Proverbs. The first one is Proverbs 13:24. In the King James it reads, He that spareth his rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasteneth him betimes. Now remember what we just talked about. That word rod, it's shevet again, it is primarily a symbol of authority, of guidance, of leadership. It was not a spanking tool. So note how this verse says absolutely nothing about spanking the way that we think of it, and not even anything about hitting. It just talks about sparing the rod. Now, what exactly does that mean? See, that's an important question to ask because people see that and they immediately jump to, oh, it means you should spank. But is that all you can use a rod for? Is just for hitting? Absolutely not. You can use a rod to guide. If a rod is a symbol of authority, you can use it to teach. We should not be so quick to take something that has multiple meanings and automatically assume that just the one we want to be there is actually what it means. See, a more literal translation of this verse would be, the one who withholds his staff demotes his son, but the one who loves him watches out for training. Do you hear the difference there? Let me read the King James one more time. He that spareth his rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasteneth him betimes. But a better translation is, the one who withholds his staff demotes his son, but the one who loves him watches out for training. Let's talk about those differences a little bit, because they're not the same thing at all. First, let's talk about sparing, because sparing, at least in modern English, seems to have the idea of, like, the opposite of being liberal with something. It sounds like you're being stingy with something. So the implication then would be that if you're not to spare the rod, you should actually be liberal with the rod. You should use it frequently. But the word really just means to withhold, to keep back. And that can mean at all. So this isn't necessarily saying that this has to be a frequent thing. Rather, it's just talking about in general doing this at all. And what is it that we're doing? Not beating, definitely not spanking, but rather instructing. Because did you know that what the King James translates as hates his son, I said is actually demotes his son? That's because the Hebrew word there is about status. In an honor-shame culture like the ancient Near East had, it really mattered that you be seen as being of higher status than someone else. So the author of this verse is teaching that if you never step in to instruct your children, to guide your children, to lead your children, if you are an absentee parent, you are going to demote them in the social status of the day. They're not going to know how to go out and live life because they don't have anyone who has come before and taught them what to do. Let's talk about the second half. The one who loves him watches out for training. King James said, chasteneth him betimes. And betimes is a archaic way of saying early. I don't think anyone in church today that uses the King James actually knows what betimes means, but if they happen to look it up in a dictionary, this could give the idea that you are supposed to hit your children at a young age. That is not at all what it means, though. Now, a lot of translations will actually say diligently here, like you are to discipline diligently, and that's okay. But I think a better translation of that word is actually to be on the lookout for something. So the most literalistic way that you can render this is not chastening early or even often, but rather that they are watching out for, looking out for, searching out opportunities for training. See, that word chastening, I don't know about you, but when I hear that, I immediately think of physical discipline because that is the way it was used in the circles I grew up in. But that is not what chastening means. Chastening just means to instruct or to correct. There is usually a corrective element to it, but I can correct you for being wrong about something without physically harming you. I do this every day at work. My job is to be an auditor of mortgage documents. And constantly, every time I make a request, people give me wrong information. It's guaranteed. Drives me crazy. And so all throughout the day, I am correcting people on the information that they provided me and saying, no, this is not correct. You should have written this instead. Please provide the correct information. That is biblical chastening. I have never once lifted a hand against those people. I work remotely, so I couldn't even if I wanted to. And believe me, sometimes I do. But that's beside the point. I am still correcting them. I am chastening them without any form of physical harm happening. That is what this means. This verse is not saying that you should rise up and hit your children if you really love them. No, it's saying that if you withhold the symbol of your authority, if you are absent as a parent, If you reject your role as being a guiding adult in their lives, you are not loving them. Because somebody who does love their children takes opportunities to train them for life. And notice how the opposite of hating your child here is training them early, not physically harming them. That is so important. We come to these verses with so many assumptions that we have totally missed what they are actually saying in plain text right in front of our eyes. As a side note, I want you to observe how many of these verses we're going to talk about are actually about training up an older son. There is no mention of daughters due to this being in a patriarchal culture where sons were expected to lead. These words of wisdom were not parenting advice regardless of the sex of the child, but specific guidance for young men going into adulthood to be successful in the male dominated ancient Near East. And that is a very different cultural setting than where we are today. And once again, I am not just making up some progressive interpretation here. I came into this with the understanding that spanking is the only biblical way to discipline children. But Jewish interpretation historically has seen this kind of verse as being about firm, consistent moral guidance, not about corporal punishment. But in fact, Jewish instruction forbids causing injury to a child. I'll link to an article in the show notes from reformjudaism.org where Dr. William Berkson, director of the Jewish Institute for Youth and Family, writes, "By the Talmudic principle, these harsh doctrines of parental discipline were replaced with an emphasis on kindness and compassion. The Talmud defines the rebellious son out of existence, rules that the teacher could punish a student at most with a leather shoelace, outlaws hitting grown children, and declares, with a child, push away with the left hand and draw near with the right, the right hand normally being the stronger." As a result of these rabbinic teachings, traditional Jewish homes were noted for treating their children with love and warmth. Crystal Lutton wrote, "There is also very clear instruction in Leviticus 19:14, do not put a stumbling block before the blind, which is later applied to avoiding spanking an older child who might be tempted to strike back and lack the self-control not to do so, which would cause him to violate the commandment to honor his father and mother. Because the spanking might result in the child violating a commandment, the parent is forbidden from administering the spanking." According to Eliezer C. Abrahamson, Talmud Torah's Center for Basic Jewish Education, the Talmud teaches us that a father who strikes an older son is to be excommunicated. Jewish legal authorities inform us that while this law only mentions an older child, it is actually true of any child who might possibly react improperly. And I have one more lengthy quote here from a Jewish site that I will also link to in the show notes. It explains the shift in perspective really well and helps to put the rod passages in context. Here's what it says. What staff was King Solomon talking about? A staff is solid and doesn't change. A staff is used for support on one's way. For parenting rules to successfully show our children that we are trying to build them in ways that are good for them, the rules must be solid and consistent. They must support the growth of the children on their paths and protect the needs of the parents. The staff is the measuring stick that the parents can use to show the child that there are realities and principles that obligate us all. Adults who have solid principles that support them in all their ways will be able to measure the behavior of their children in a predictable and safe way, and respond to inappropriate behavior in ways that don't undermine their parental authority or just blow off anger. They will be able to feel the support and love within themselves and be able to support and love their children. One who loves his child disciplines him in his youth. If you love your child, you will help him to develop himself in a disciplined way in his youth before things get out of hand. You will make time to explain to your child, not in the heat of anger, but in a moment of warmth and understanding, why you expect him to behave in a particular way, and why that is important to you and ultimately to him. It's pretty simple. Who you are is how you'll parent. Can I say that again? Who you are is how you'll parent. You can only teach what you know. You can only give what you have. You can only build with the tools in your box. Fill yourself with warmth, goodness, and all that you dream of for your children. They will know you as a treasure chest and come to fill themselves with knowledge and nourishment for life. End quote. That is fantastic. It really helps to show that there is a lengthy tradition of realizing that Proverbs uses metaphorical language and that these uses of shevet, of rod, of staff, are not about a literal instrument that you are to beat your children with, but rather about your own parental authority and expertise that you are to use to instruct them and to show them how best to live out life. So with that in mind, let's look at the next verse, Proverbs 22:15. This verse reads, "Foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction will drive it far from him." Much like with the previous verse, we often read in that parents are to punish a child physically. But if you actually pay attention to the verse and come at it without an initial bias of what you believe it says, the verse never reads that this is for parents. It also doesn't have anything to say about using the staff to beat someone with. And furthermore, it doesn't mean that every child naturally has horrible sin that you have to beat out of them. It's literally just saying that children are immature and inexperienced. A more literal translation of this verse would read, "Lack of discernment co-conspires within the heart of a child, but the educating staff pushes it far from him." Let me give you those two side by side again here. Foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction will drive it far from him. In a better translation, lack of discernment co-conspires with the heart of a child, but the educating staff pushes it far from him. Anyone who has ever parented or worked with children at all knows that a lack of discernment does indeed co-conspire within the heart of a child. They are learning how to be human for the first time. They have lack of discernment by definition of being a child. They have not had the experience to discern how to behave. But the educating staff pushes it far from him. Notice what the educating staff is doing. It's pushing something. What's the it? Not the child. Rather, the lack of discernment. So the staff is not to be used to beat the child, but rather used to beat away or ward off a lack of discernment. It has this lack of discernment personified almost like a wolf out to get a sheep. And the shepherd uses his staff not to hit the sheep because it got too close to the wolf, but rather to push away the wolf to protect the sheep. The staff is used on the problem, not on the person dealing with the problem. This goes to show that once again, this is not about using a literal instrument to beat a child. It is for anyone with life experience and a relationship to a child in a community-centric culture like the ancient Near East would be, to have a part in educating them in wisdom and discernment, giving them the benefits of life experience without having yet experienced life themselves. This verse does not in any way say that parents should use the rod to beat. It says that the rod of discipline, the educating staff, removes folly, meaning that communal relational wisdom, guidance from elders, and life experience helps mature a child. The way that happens is left open, and we do a disservice to the Bible by assuming that a book chock full of metaphors is using the word rod literally here. I know I'm kind of beating a dead horse here, semi-pun intended, but this has been so ingrained in our modern American mindset that I feel like I have to consistently repeat this because of how hard it was for me to get this in my own brain, to remove the indoctrination that was put there in the name of God, but that has nothing to do with the text. There is a difference between seeing a rod as a literal staff and seeing it as the metaphorical stand-in for using your position of authority to teach and instruct. Honestly, you could sub out the word rod for the word authority in any of these verses, and it would make just as much, if not more sense. And again, I am not trying to defang the Bible here or make it less painful for a modern audience. I'm just telling you what in its ancient context it would have meant. This has nothing to do with us being too soft in the modern age. The Bible uses metaphors and even exaggerated and extreme language to prove a point. And you all already know this. When you read Proverbs, do you believe that God wants you to actually search for a literal woman named Wisdom? Do you believe that a person who obtains wisdom will literally wear a crown? Does ponder the path of your feet literally mean that you have to keep your eyes on the ground when you walk? Are a prostitute's lips actually smoother than oil? Or is the author proving a point by showing a caricature, an exaggerated extreme to compare and contrast the choices we have in life? Could not then most, if not all of these proverbs be seen as using the word rod as metonymy to refer to any form of discipline, including what is sometimes labeled as gentle parenting? It absolutely can. And remember, these are proverbs, not promises, not commands. There is nothing here that says, "Thou shalt spank your son to be holy and obedient to God." Rather, the author is saying, life is crazy, and kids are crazy, and you are crazy, and there are going to be times that you are tempted to hit autopilot and unintentionally let the kids parent themselves. But they can't. They were never made to at that age. They have never humaned before. They don't know how to. They need someone who already has. Discipline, which is not just physical punishment. It can be teaching, training, even correcting. It can take many forms, and it's better than being an absent or passive parent. Be involved in your children's lives, not just in correcting them, but in instructing them. Not just in being reactive, which is what most punishment is, but rather in being proactive. That's what Proverbs 22:15 is all about. Let's jump ahead one chapter and see Proverbs 23, verses 13 to 14. Withhold not correction from the child, for if you beat him with the rod, he will not die. You will beat him with the rod, and you will deliver his soul from hell. I know some of you right now are going, see, Colin, we got you. This verse clearly is telling you to spank. Well, not so fast. We have to remember context. First off, we have to remember that this is the ancient Near Eastern form of beating that we are talking about, not the modern idea of spanking. Secondly, this is the only rod verse that has an imperative, a command aspect to it. All the others are in third person, talking about the person who. This is speaking directly to you, second person. Don't withhold correction. Okay? So there is an imperative aspect to this. However, there are also other imperative statements in Proverbs that we understand to be hyperbolic. Most Christians have never put a knife to their throat if they overate. Look at Proverbs 23:2, just a few verses earlier. Most do not hand out wine to the suffering, despite that being a command in chapter 31, verse 6. And none of us are out there answering a fool according to his folly, while simultaneously not answering a fool according to his folly, as chapter 26, verses 4 and 5 command back to back. We understand that there are principles illustrated by these word pictures. The importance of contentment and being a gracious guest in 23:2. The way in which alcohol can deceptively soothe in 31:6. And the wisdom of knowing how to respond in different circumstances. 26:4-5. So keep that in mind as we approach this. Don't just say, oh, there's a command here, therefore it obviously means you have to physically hit your children. All right, it's not that simple. And we're about to make it more complicated, because this verse reads, he will not die. Right? If you strike him with the rod, he will not die. However, in Exodus, a rod is specifically said to be something that can kill someone. So this quote-unquote guarantee here that if you strike him with the rod, he's not going to die, directly contradicts a statement in Exodus about what happens when a rod is used to kill someone. In fact, the word translated beat is often translated as kill, or even more violently, slaughter in the Bible. So a more literal, emphatic translation of verse 13 is, if you kill him with the rod, he won't die. Think about that for a second. If the scriptural authors were talking about a literal rod here, we would be finding a major contradiction, because it says he shall not die. If you kill him with the rod, he won't die. How does that work? Well, if you take it in a literal sense, going against the context of the verse, the chapter, and the book, it doesn't. But if you understand this within its intended context by God as being about instruction, that makes more sense. You can't actually kill someone with your authority, with your instruction. You can be striking, quote unquote, them with your authority by using that authority to discipline, which again does not have to mean physical punishment. It can mean to teach, to disciple, to educate, to instruct, and to guide them. And some of you are going, okay, maybe that's true of verse 13, but what about verse 14? It says, thou shalt beat him with the rod. It doesn't get more command than that, right? Thou shalt beat him with the rod. Except that's not a command. It's actually not an imperative verb here. It's just a future tense, more literally saying, you will do this, as in, this is something that you will do in the future. It's assuming a hypothetical. It's like if someone told me that they were going to go to the store for something, and I said, you go to the store, you'll get stuck in traffic. I'm not making an absolute statement or command there of you must get stuck in traffic. Rather, I'm just saying that if there is an understood if in there implied. If you go to the store at this time of day, you will get stuck in traffic. And this is the same thing here. That's the idea. If you do what this verse says, which is what we're about to talk about, you will deliver his soul from hell. And that word hell, if you are not familiar with this, I would tell you to go check out our mini-series of Eternal Rest Stops, where we talk about the words behind heaven and hell in the Bible. Because this here is Sheol, which does not at all mean hell like we think of today. So this has nothing to do with salvation or making sure that your child turns out as somebody who believes in God. Rather, Sheol is just literally the grave, death. So deliver his soul from Sheol literally just means you will deliver his life from death. It does not mean you will save him spiritually. The implication is probably being that correction, instruction, will prevent a developing child or hormonal teenager from making too many stupid decisions that will shorten his life, especially in a society that had laws about stoning rebellious children. Now, side note on that, we have no record of those laws ever actually being carried out. And as we displayed earlier, Jewish tradition has actually built on that fences that prevent violence against children. So this verse actually reads, if you kill him with your authority, he will not die. And that is meant to be a provocative statement because we know that a rod can actually be used to kill someone. So it is causing us to think, how can we use our authority in a way that actually does not? And then verse 14, if you use your authority in a striking way, you will prevent untimely death from happening. So, once again, we have a metaphorical rod. This is about discipline, guidance, correction, not physical blows. So far, we have gotten through 4 of the 5 Proverbs verses, and we have found that none of them directly command you to hit a child. Rather, they talk about metaphorical use of experience and authority to guide them in their lives. So let's look at the last one now. Proverbs 19:15. The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings his mother to shame. As with all of these verses, this one has been misused a lot. In fact, I remember hearing the Duggars use this verse when they were talking about their adult son Josh and the CSA porn that he was into, making it sound like they actually weren't controlling enough of him in his childhood, and that was then used as a reasoning of why adult children should not be out of the home without being married. It's really perverted, twisted way of handling this passage and avoiding actual responsibility for the harms that were done there. Nearly all English translations have the idea of this being a child either left to himself or at very least an undisciplined child. But the most literal way to translate this is a child sent out makes his mother ashamed. Think about that with me. A child sent out makes his mother ashamed. Now, there can certainly be an undisciplined idea there, but notice how the focus isn't actually on the child. Sent out is passive. It doesn't say a child who goes out or who leaves the home makes his mother ashamed, but rather one who is sent out. It's the parents who send the kids away. This verse is not a warning to beat your children so they don't embarrass you when they leave the house. It's actually a warning to parents not to disown their children, and also not to let them grow up too fast when they still need to learn from you. I can't help but even think there's a little bit of a hint of the Hagar and Ishmael story going on here. And note how no part of this commands physical punishment. In fact, just 2 verses later, verse 17, gives us the flip of this. Correct your son, and he will give you rest. Correction is the inverse of sending the child out. Not corporal punishment, not hitting, but instruction. And just one other thought here for you. If Solomon really did write these proverbs, we should consider how his children turned out. Spoiler alert, his son split the kingdom and led the people in sin. Israel was never the same again after that. So maybe we shouldn't be getting parenting advice from him. Just a thought. Before we move on into another section, I want to address a few other verses here, because there are other passages that get brought into this discussion that don't really have anything to do with spanking. A great example of this will be Proverbs 3:11-12, which reads, "My son, despise not the chastening of Yahweh, neither be weary of his correction. For whom Yahweh loves, he corrects, even as a father the son in whom he delights." So that kind of verse will get brought in and say, see, we have to spank, we have to make sure we discipline early. But pay very close attention to this text. There is no part in here that mentions the rod, that mentions beating, that mentions spanking, that mentions any kind of physical discipline. The words used are chastening and correction. Neither one of those demands physical violence. And in fact, I would argue that both of those are more just about verbal instruction. That is the literal meaning of these Hebrew words. It does not have to be corporal punishment, and we do a disservice when we misinterpret the Bible by redefining these words to mean what we think they're supposed to mean rather than what they actually meant. So we can't just bring in a verse that talks about correction and then do this little bait and switch where we say, okay, so now it's talking about spanking. No, 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 no. You can't take something that is about correction, that's about instruction, and make it mean something else just so you have more verses to back up your argument. That is extremely dishonest and disrespectful to God and His Word. And this kind of thing happens all the time, where people try to beef up their argument by having extra references thrown in to make it sound like what they're talking about is really biblical, but it's really the logical fallacy of false equivalence, treating two alternative statements as being virtually equal when they actually are not. This happens with other verses like Proverbs 19:18 or Proverbs 22:6. And just because they talk about discipline or instruction or correction, it is assumed that then those are talking about spanking. That would be like taking a 101 class on cooking and saying that all of the instructions that you learned were actually about sous videing. Okay, sous vide is a form of cooking. It is a way that you can prepare food, but it is not the only way. And if you were to then take every reference to how to cook food and say this was actually talking about how you were supposed to sous vide, that would not be the least bit accurate. There are some forms of cooking that are just not going to mesh with sous vide. You can't take general instructions and say that they are about one very specific form of instruction. That is misrepresenting the text. Similarly, another passage that will get brought into this sometimes is Deuteronomy 21:18-21. It's talking about the rebellious child. And I want to read these verses here so you can actually see what they really have to say. "If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son, which will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and that, when they have chastened him, will not hearken to them, then should the father and mother lay hold on him, and bring him to the elders of the city unto the gate of the place. And they will say to the elders of the city, This our son is stubborn and rebellious, he will not obey our voice, he is a glutton and a drunkard. And the men of the city will stone him with stones that he die. So shalt thou put the evil away from among you, and all Israel will hear and fear." And some will say, see, this proves that physical discipline is biblical. But they're not paying attention to the text. We have to actually pay attention. Do I sound like a broken record yet? Note what happens here. What's the first thing the parents do? Do they beat him? No. The first thing they do, if you're looking for a biblical pattern of child rearing, look at what the first thing is that the parents do here. They speak to the child. It says that he won't obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother. That means that they have used their voices to try to instruct him. And then the word chastening is used. Note that it's not a word about beating, or there's not even anything about a rod being used here. It's simply a word of correction. So apparently first they just talked to him about it. And if that doesn't work, then they try to correct him. Not physically, but just instructing him. And only after all these attempts fail does the law allow for stoning, which, again, we have no record of ever actually being practiced. And personally, as a Christian, I believe that Jesus completely undoes this logic in John chapter 8, where he says that you shouldn't stone unless you are in a position where someone else could not stone you for the same thing. And everyone walked away. And can I just point out that if we are not stoning children, we are not taking these passages literally. So we are already reinterpreting them. Which means that we also shouldn't be using this passage to justify hitting them, because that's nowhere here in the text at all. Now, you may have noticed we have spent a good bit of time in the Tanakh here, in the Old Testament. So some of you may be thinking, okay, well, what about the New Testament? There's got to be something there, right? There's not. There are no instructions on spanking or hitting children in the New Testament. Now, there is one passage that occasionally gets brought into this, and that's Hebrews 12, 5-11. So let's look at that now. We don't know who the author of Hebrews is. It's never stated. It's almost certainly not Paul, but he is writing to a Hebrew audience, hence the name of the book. And he writes, "You have forgotten the exhortation which was spoken to you as children. My son, despise not the chastening of our Lord, nor faint when you are rebuked of him. For whom Yahweh loves, he chastens, and scourges every son he receives. If you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is he whom the Father chastens not? But if you be without chastisement, whereof all are partakers, then you are bastards and not sons. Furthermore, we have had fathers of our flesh which corrected us, and we gave them reverence. Shall we not much rather be in subjection to the Father of spirits, and live? For they truly for a few days chastened us after their own pleasure, but he for our profit, that we might be partakers of his holiness. Now no chastening for the present seems to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless, afterward it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby." Now this passage does get used occasionally to support hitting children, since that is the only verse that seems to bring this practice into the New Testament. But notice that there are no commands here. In fact, all of the words used are of instruction, not of physical punishment, with one exception. And that one exception is verse 6 that mentions whipping. But God is the one who is said to whip his children. Now, all of the problems of that aside, stop for a second and consider, does God actually physically beat anyone? No, he doesn't have a body. So that is obviously metaphorical. I don't think that's a controversial statement. God does not physically whip anyone, so this verse must be read in a metaphorical sense. Even the most conservative pastor would tell you this is a metaphor for God's using life circumstances to refine you, not that he physically whips you. So maybe we should follow that example as well, and use life circumstances to refine, not physical whipping. And if you need further evidence of this, the only explicit parenting command in the entire New Testament appears just twice, and both times it says this: don't provoke your children to anger. Ephesians 6:4 and Colossians 3:21. Let me read those for you. Ephesians 6:4. You fathers, don't provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And Colossians 3:21. Fathers, don't provoke your children to anger, so that they don't become discouraged. Training does not equal spanking. Instruction does not equal hitting. Guidance does not equal physical pain. Jesus himself said that harming a child warrants death by drowning. That is the biblical weight of this issue. And that's it for biblical evidence. Now, as we talked about at the very start, there is nothing in the Bible about our modern practice of spanking, because that has been brought over from ancient pre-Christian pagan sexual rites and converted into a form of child discipline. And even the passages that seem to talk about physical punishment of a child aren't actually really talking about that. Instead, when we allow the message of the text to come through on its own, stripped of the cultural baggage that we have brought to it, we find that the consistent teachings of the Bible are just to use verbal instruction and correction and the example of one's own life to raise children. And furthermore, that ancient and modern Jewish tradition, as well as Jesus and Paul, all come together to say that using physical violence against children is a sure way to cause more harm than good and drive an emotional wedge in the relationship that can take years to undo, if at all. Friends, I was taught from a very early age that spanking is the only proper biblical form of discipline, and anything short of that physical violence against a child was disobedience against God Himself, and a sure sign of a weak parent who was just asking for a rebellious child. I was certain this was right. I was certain this is what the Bible taught. And yet, as I've studied Scripture for myself, I have found the exact opposite to be true. I'm not talking about bringing in modern science or therapy or psychology or any of that. Oh, we're going to get to that soon, but we haven't even touched on that yet. This has entirely been about just reading the Bible in its own context. And it shot down every assumption that I had about child rearing. I did not want to change my views on this because I believed I had the one right way. I was certain of this. And yet, as we have walked through for the last hour now, all of that was wrong. Like I can imagine many of you listening, was sold a wicked, vicious, violent lie of the devil by preachers who chose to read books that weren't by actual experts, either in the Bible or in psychology or in child rearing, rather than doing their own research into our holy scriptures. And that has caused untold amounts of harm. And yet, despite this past hour of conversation, I can't help but think that some of you listening are still struggling to accept some of what I have said. Even though we have laid out every Bible verse that can possibly come into this conversation and have something to say about spanking or physical discipline at all, some of you still have a lot of pressure in your minds pushing against what I have said and convincing you it cannot be right. And so I want to take a few minutes and talk about why that is next. This can feel like a very threatening conversation for a lot of people. And I believe the primary reason for that is fear. Fear that if we don't parent the quote-unquote right way, our kids will go astray. Yet 1 John teaches us that perfect love casts out fear, that fear and love cannot coexist. Parenting from a place of fear just creates more fear, both in the parents and in the children. And I can't help but think that most of you out there, even those of you who have spanked or plan to, actually hate the idea. You really don't want to do it. But you continue to go against your conscience because you have been told it's the only way to please God and have obedient children. But friends, if everything in you says that something is wrong, except for a couple of Bible verses that seem to say something different, then I guarantee you have been taught to misread the Bible. God gave you your conscience and the wisdom of experts. Listen to them. You are not being called to be a martyr for God by crying while you faithfully beat your child. The hard reality is that spanking is actually the easy way out. I said it, and I'll stand by it. None of that, this is going to hurt me more than it hurts you, BS. Spanking allows adults to vent their emotional frustrations on a person who can't defend themselves and call it right. Good parenting is hard work. It requires taking time to instruct and listen to your children at the most inconvenient of times. Spanking is the disciplinary equivalent of taking a hungry child to McDonald's because you're too tired to cook a meal. Sure, it'll quiet them down, but it's actually harming them in the long run and not giving them the nutrition they need to grow. And I know that most of you out there don't actually want to do that. It's just because of fear that has been instilled in you. Fear that if you don't parent the right way, your kids will go astray. And also, I think second, just a fear of being wrong. I had this conversation in a much shortened version with a friend a couple years back. And I laid out for him the biblical arguments that we have gone through. And he got very defensive very fast and said that he felt like a bear whose honey pot was being taken away when I challenged his views on spanking. He lashed out because the idea of losing the right to hit a child felt like a loss of control. If he turned out to be wrong about this, he would have to come face to face with the reality that he had caused very real physical, psychological, emotional, and spiritual harm to innocent toddlers who, in that particular situation, already had some disabilities. It is scary to have your image of yourself as a good person shattered by the possibility that you have actually been abusive to people. It is. But we're not always the good guys of the story. Sometimes we have been taught wrong things that we perpetuate. That happens. That's life. And please hear me here. That does not automatically mean you are a bad person. It means you have an opportunity right now to not become one by admitting you were wrong, instead of digging your heels in and causing more harm just so that you don't have to admit to your own wrongdoing. Good people can be misinformed and do bad things. Now, if you get correct information and you still choose to do the wrong thing, that's when you start to become a bad person. We all do things out of ignorance and misinformation sometimes. But good people will take the opportunity to admit they have been wrong and change their ways. Bad people dig their heels in and continue to cause harm just so they don't ever have to admit to being wrong. And if your ability to beat your children is so precious to you that you can't admit you were wrong, there is something seriously broken within you. If something hits that close to home, it's worth wrestling with. If something makes you that uncomfortable, you should ask why it is striking that nerve. You shouldn't just push against it because it makes you uncomfortable. If it's uncomfortable, it's probably something that needs to be considered. And believe me, I know this is not easy. Like I said at the start, I am not trying to ask any of you to take my position on something. I am just laying out the information that my experience as a biblical scholar and therapist have taught me, and many others. This is not something that I changed my mind on overnight. It took a lot of study. I am taking years of painful study and distilling it in a little over an hour for you all right now. But the minute that I became convinced of what I have told you, I immediately changed my positions because it was the only honest thing to do. Thankfully, that was before I had children. But as a Bible teacher, I had taught and encouraged spanking. So I still needed to admit my own wrongdoing and repent of that. It was difficult. And it will be difficult for anyone else that follows that path. But I had to choose honesty and fidelity to my sacred scriptures over my own personal ego. The next generation deserves that. I think a third reason this conversation is so hard is because we parent based on how we imagine God. Let me say that again. We parent based on how we imagine God. If you believe that God is primarily punitive, you will parent punitively. If you believe that God is patient, compassionate, and slow to anger, the biblical position, you'll parent that way. Jesus is clear. Let the little children come to me, not let them come after a spanking. How you parent tells me everything I need to know about what you believe about God and whether you believe he is actually punitive or actually loving. And the sad reality is, even though most of us would say we believe God is love, we act as if he's the exact opposite. And it shows in the ways that we treat others, especially the most vulnerable, like children. I wanted to spend the majority of this conversation talking about the Bible because that's what this podcast is primarily about. But once we have exhausted the relevant biblical texts, the research beyond that becomes unavoidable. Every single major medical, psychological, and pediatric organization opposes spanking. the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Psychological Association, the CDC, who, here is what research shows. Spanking increases aggression in children. Multiple longitudinal studies have shown that children who are spanked are more likely, not less, but more likely to hit others, including siblings and peers, because that is the example that has been set for them. Think about that with me. A child does something wrong, and you hit them. You are subliminally teaching them that the way to correct wrongdoing is through violence. And we all know that children are more likely to pick up what we do than what we say. So they are going to repeat, they are going to mimic those actions in dealing with others. And they are going to see violence as a legitimate way to solve problems. Secondly, spanking does not improve behavior long term. It may stop a behavior in the moment out of fear, but it does not teach self-control, emotional regulation, or problem solving, all things that children need to develop to become healthy adults. I can honestly say that spanking never made me feel like I was any more wrong than I already knew I was from being caught and corrected. The addition of physical pain only motivated me to become better at hiding my bad behavior so I wouldn't get caught. It drove me further from people who could have helped me mature as a person, leading to avoidance issues that I still deal with today as an adult. Third, it increases anxiety and depression. Spanked children show higher cortisol levels, higher anxiety markers, and higher risk of mental health issues in the future. Fourth, it damages trust and attachment. Children interpret physical punishment as abandonment and unpredictability. Fifth, it is statistically linked to lower academic performance, higher risk of substance abuse, higher risk of leaving the faith that they grew up in, higher risk of future domestic violence, higher likelihood of engaging in BDSM or sexualized pain later in life, and higher risk of self-harm. Now, I want to be very clear. None of these are guaranteed, but it does increase the risks. Sixth, it teaches the wrong lesson. Rather than teaching the child, I did wrong, it teaches, I got caught. And children learn to hide behavior rather than change it. And most haunting of all, spanking normalizes private physical discipline from an adult, which predators experienced at grooming can exploit. When the body becomes a site of parental punishment, children are less likely to distinguish abusive touch from discipline. And that's not just hypothetical. That has happened a lot. Just ask anyone who has worked in foster care. There is a reason that most foster parents do not spank. It's because they have seen the very real effects that physical discipline has on unintentionally grooming children to be okay with physical and sexual abuse in the future. And again, I want to be very clear. None of this is a guarantee. Obviously, there are people who have been spanked who have not been physically or sexually abused. Obviously, there are people who have been spanked who have not dealt with depression. There are people who have been spanked who have not done poorly in school. Absolutely. It's not a guarantee, but we're dealing with statistics here and likelihood. And when we are trying to set up our children for success, we want to do the things that are statistically most likely to get them ready for a successful adult life. I have heard plenty of pushback here. I have heard so many people say, well, I was spanked and I turned out fine. Okay, you can be okay despite something, not because of something. That is a logical fallacy of false correlation. It would be like saying, well, I never wore a seatbelt in the car and I've never gone flying out the windshield. All right, you might not be negatively affected by not wearing a seatbelt. That is possible. But not wearing a seatbelt is not going to have a positive effect on you. It just increases the risk for a negative thing to happen. And honestly, I probably shouldn't say this because I'm going to offend some of you, but I have yet to hear a single person who said, well, I was spanked and I turned out just fine, where I didn't immediately think, yeah, you really need a lot more therapy than you realize. It tends to come out of the mouths of people who lack a self-awareness of their own remaining issues that still need to be addressed from childhood. Similarly, though, I have heard some people say, well, I've spanked and I never meant it in a sexual way, or I was spanked and I'm not into that with sex. Once again, being spanked as a child is not a guarantee that bad things will happen, but it does raise the likelihood that they will. And same thing with kinks here. Being spanked as a child is not a guarantee you will be into BDSM or other sexual kinks, but it does raise the likelihood, as well as the likelihood of self-harm, because you are instilling in an impressionable child the idea that self-improvement and atonement come through pain. And I want to be clear here, I am not against the idea of spanking as a sexual kink between consenting adults, but it's just kind of funny to me how people who are okay with doing that with children tend to be people who aren't so okay with adults doing it. And I think the opposite should actually be true. Consenting adults can do what they want. Children, however, cannot consent to what is being done to their bodies. Now, depending on which news station you tend to listen to, you may have heard justification this year for younger and younger ages of children being responsible for their bodies. I do not condone that at all. This is a side note, but if you have news anchors that are talking about things being done to 15-year-olds not being that bad or being justifiable in a certain sense, you should probably change news outlets. Hopefully enough said going down that little rabbit trail. Going back to pushback, I've heard some people say, well, look at how badly kids behave today. It's because we stopped spanking. But we need to be careful not to blame all of today's issues on a lack of spanking. For one thing, many people today still are spanked. If that weren't the case, we wouldn't have had to have had this conversation today. That being said, yes, there has been a shift in culture where people are starting to realize the physical, psychological, emotional harms that come from physically beating children. So culture is starting to shift away from that. But spanking isn't the only thing that's changed, and it's not the reason for all good that happened in the past. People are living longer today than at any point in centuries past. Is that because there's less spanking? See, there are too many factors to focus on only one. That's really dishonest social science. Some people say, but when I spanked, I didn't do it in an abusive way, or I didn't mean to hurt anyone long term. Well, what's that saying we all know about the road to hell? Just because you meant something as instructive doesn't mean it wasn't actually abusive. Good people can do bad things, particularly when they are in bad situations or have been given misinformation, especially in the name of God. Intent is important, but it's not the only thing that has to be taken into consideration. You can have good intentions and do bad things. I know some people are afraid of what kids will be allowed to do if they are not spanked, but we should not equate a lack of spanking with permissiveness. If your job has a casual Friday, that doesn't mean that suddenly everything goes on Friday. The only thing that has changed is a slightly relaxed dress code. Changing one previous man-made standard is not the same thing as throwing out all rules. Anyone who says differently is fear-mongering. This is not anti-authority. It's anti-abuse of authority. If you think they're the same, that shows how toxic our current authority systems tend to be. And there will still, despite all of this, be some people who will say, but it's in the Bible! And yet today we have seen it's not. Just because you have heard it preached 1,000 times does not mean it's right. It just means that people were wrong 1,000 times. Or more likely that all of the preachers we've listened to read or listened to the same sources and didn't do their due diligence to double check. Just because something used to be the standard doesn't mean we got it right. We used to think bloodletting was healing. We used to think the sun orbited the earth. We used to think women's hair pulled a man's sperm up into her body to fertilize her. Slave masters used to have a right to beat slaves. Even husbands had a right to beat their wives. Just because there was a perceived right to do something does not mean it actually was right. Christians are often talking about not bending to peer pressure and going with the flow just because people say to. So stop doing it here. Listen to the experts using their God-given wisdom and listen to the Bible and stop. Even if you don't believe any of what I have said, here is an angle that I want you to consider. Perhaps God assumed the culture of the people to whom he was speaking without endorsing it. Just because something isn't spoken of in a blatantly negative fashion in the Bible doesn't necessarily mean God approves. Case in point, slavery. God never came right out and said abolish slavery. You will never find that verse in Scripture because it's not there. But you can argue that he sowed the seeds for a culture that no longer needed it. He never specifically says, don't spank. But he lays out the groundwork for a culture in which that seems out of place at best. There is no other situation in which a single one of us would say God says violence is the answer, least of all to someone weaker than you. Imagine with me a situation where there is a husband and wife, and the husband asks the wife to do something, and for whatever reason, she doesn't do it. So he goes ahead and he hits her. I think all of us listening would take that as a very serious breach of his relationship with her. I think we would all call it abuse, domestic violence, and likely get the cops involved. Yet somehow, if the wife in that story is switched out for a person under 18 or under 13, it suddenly becomes acceptable? That sounds even worse when you say it out loud. Friends, if it's not okay with an adult, it's definitely not okay with a child. So can we maybe say that God did not approve of everything about the culture of ancient Israel, yet he worked within the culture of the day to limit it? I do not doubt there was a lot of physical violence against children in the ancient Near East, just like there is today. We haven't changed that much as people. But notice how our God-inspired passages of Scripture speak specifically of correction and never allow for physical violence in child rearing out of anger, frustration, emotion, or any other reason. Consider with me how many verses there are in our sacred scriptures that talk about how protective God is of the vulnerable. And who is more vulnerable than children? Or consider all of the one another verses of the epistles, Romans 12:10, 2 Corinthians 13:11. Those apply to the parent-child relationship as well. We should reflect love for our smallest and newest neighbors in the world, and remember that Jesus' strongest words of warning were against anyone who would hurt children or lead them to lose faith. Matthew 18:6. And hat tip to Marissa Burt for those insights. So why are we so strongly defensive of a very non-gospel issue? I don't just mean that as a rhetorical question. I actually believe I have an answer if you'll hear me out. It is rooted in fear. Fear that if I don't do the right thing as a parent, my kid won't turn out right. But you cannot parent out of fear. Remember 1 John, it is impossible to live in both fear and love at the same time. Parenting out of fear makes for anxious, ill-equipped children. And evidence shows that spanking is statistically more likely to push your kids away from you and your faith over time than other forms of discipline. So what can we do instead? Well, first we need to realize that a lack of spanking is not the same thing as permissiveness. There is still a need for discipline in child rearing. Anyone who gives you this either or of spanking or letting your kids do whatever they want, they are presenting you with a false dichotomy. Discipline means training. It does not mean punishment. There are better options, all evidence-based, and I will link to resources in the show notes that give a lot more information on this. But just briefly, it can look like connection before correction. A well-regulated child can learn. A dysregulated child will struggle to. It also looks like natural consequences. This is the kind of thing that God engages in Scripture. Punishment in the Bible is very rarely God doing something additional, but rather just letting people live out the natural consequences of their actions. If you refuse to put on your shoes when we're going out to the car, you walk barefoot to the car. It doesn't mean you get a spanking. It just means that reality is going to be the teacher rather than pain. Having time-ins instead of time-outs. Sitting with them, helping them name and learn their feelings. Co-regulation that helps to build the prefrontal cortex. And that is really, really hard because it requires the parent to have done that work for themselves first. Which is why it is so important to have this conversation before you have kids, or as early on in the process as possible. Because parenting is going to bring out in you all of the things that you didn't get to work out from your own time growing up. Think about that. There is no world in which I have the current skill set to teach someone else how to fix their car. I can only teach you to be as good of a mechanic as I personally am. I cannot teach you how to become better than I am. Because then, if I can teach that, I would be that. And I am a very sucky mechanic. I do not know how to do that stuff. So if for some reason I felt like I had this need to teach someone how to be a mechanic, I would first need to put in the work myself to learn how to be a mechanic. If you feel the need to bring a mini human into the world, you need to do the work first of learning how to be an adult so that you can teach them how to be an adult. If you have not worked through your own crap, you will not be able to help them work through theirs. And that is why it is so important that people take time in between leaving their parents' house and having children of their own. In the culture I grew up in, you were expected to marry as early as possible and start having kids as early as possible. And all that did was guarantee that people who were recently kids themselves and had not had the time and experience to learn how to be adults were saddled with being teachers on the road of life when they didn't even know how to walk that road themselves. Now, obviously, none of us are perfect and none of us are going to know everything we need to know in life. It is constantly a learning process. Going back to the car illustration, you don't have to be the world's best mechanic to be able to teach other people how to be a mechanic. But you do got to be a mechanic in the first place. You do have to have had some training. You do have to have put in some work. You do have to have experience. How much more when we are dealing with innocent, impressionable lives rather than replaceable vehicles? That leads me into the next point of teaching and modeling. Kids imitate what they see and escape what they fear. Or, in other words, be sure your parenting will find you out. If you choose to reject the complementary truths of Scripture and social science, do not be surprised if your kids reject you when they are old enough. Next, you can maintain clear, consistent boundaries. That's what the rod of authority is all about. It is a symbol of authority, not a striking of authority. And lastly, you can emphasize repair and reconnection, taking in mind Ephesians and Colossians, where Paul instructs fathers and by extension parents to not provoke their children to anger. Repair builds trust, and punishment breaks it. If your parenting is leading to consistently angry children, you are not doing it in a biblical manner. So what does biblical parenting look like? Well, it is gentle. Not permissive, but gentle. Remember that self-control is a fruit of the Spirit, not fear control. Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, never once used violence against the vulnerable. Never. Only against those who were hurting others. The biblical picture of God as a parent is compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love, guiding with a staff and rod rather than striking, and comforting with his presence. If Jesus is our model, then the question actually becomes quite simple. How would Jesus parent? I believe the answer is not with coercive power, not with fear, not with hits, beats, spanks, swats, or smacks, but with consistent presence, with boundaries rooted in love, with correction rooted in relationship, with guidance rooted in dignity, and with a refusal to cop out by using short-term effective strategies that will cause more harm in the long term. And I will admit, none of this is easy. It takes so much energy, emotionally and physically, and a crap ton of time to parent in a good manner. And even the best parents will mess up sometimes, because we are all human. That's okay. What matters is being willing to admit when you have done wrong, setting the example for your children that not even you are perfect, but that nobody has to be. They just have to be honest and willing to improve. If this episode has stirred something in you, be that grief, fear, anger, conviction, I want you to hear this clearly. Good people can do bad things when placed in bad situations. If you have participated in the unbiblical practice of spanking because you were taught that's what God wanted, you were doing what you believed was right at the time. And most of us were taught the exact same thing. But now that we know better, we are accountable to do better. And like I said at the start, this is not about guilt and shame. It's just about being the kind of parent and the kind of Christian that you want to be. Children are the most vulnerable people God has entrusted in our care. And if our God is fiercely protective of the vulnerable, then we as Christians must be as well. So here's my challenge to all of you today. Lay down the rod as a weapon, then pick it up again as the symbol of authority, guidance, and protection it has been since God inspired those texts thousands of years ago. Choose gentleness as strength. Choose connection over control. Choose love over fear. And above all, let the Bible shape your parenting, not cultural tradition. Let Jesus, not James Dobson, be your model for authority. Thank you all for listening. I know this has been a difficult conversation. So let's take a breath right now as we finish out. And let's sit in what we have heard. You don't have to agree with me, but I would love to talk more about it with you. And I would encourage for a conversation like this that maybe we stay out of the social media comment section for those. So if you would like to further discuss this, feel free to reach out via email, cconn@thebibleuncut.com. We have an email form on the homepage of our website, thebibleuncut.com, and we also have a Discord that is linked to in the notes on your podcast player, where we can talk about this more in depth in what is hopefully a healthier and more respectful environment than social media tends to be. But I pray as we close this out that whether you are currently parenting children, have in the past, hope to one day, or may not ever, that we all interact with those around us, and especially the most vulnerable, such as children, in a way that reflects the heart of Jesus. May it be so. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.